Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 18 of the regular season for the San Jose Sharks as they took on the New York Rangers and lost by a score of 3-2. It's been a pretty crazy road trip thus far that the Sharks have been on. Game 1 against a pretty good New Jersey Devils team. They come in and manage a 1-0 shutout victory. The very next day, they go up against a not-so-great Philadelphia Flyers team, fall behind 3-0 before mounting an impressive comeback and then ultimately losing in the shootout. And here tonight, they come up against the defending President's Trophy winners, the best team in the regular season last year, and a team that seemingly is going to be making the playoffs again this year, the New York Rangers, and they put up a very good fight, at least at the start of this game. I won't go so far as to say they were dominant in the first period of this game, in these first 20 minutes, but they really managed to slow the Rangers down. They made it so that this first period didn't really have a ton of flow to it, which definitely works in the advantage of the San Jose Sharks. There are not going to be many games this season where the Sharks are going to be able to afford to go blow for blow with their opponents, and it is definitely not the case here tonight against the New York Rangers, who are more talented and more experienced than them on paper. So instead, kind of bringing this to a bit of a standstill at times in this first period is definitely an advantage for the San Jose Sharks. They would score the only goal of this first period coming from Timothy Liljegren, one reminiscent to the goal scored against the New Jersey Devils by Nico Sturm, in the sense that this wasn't one that was fully created by the Sharks, and more so a bit of a lucky bounce that ends up going in their favor to make it 1-0 San Jose after the first period. The first few minutes of the second period, more of the same from the Sharks, but then it is a Mika Zibanejad goal that really turns this game on its head. A miscommunication between the Sharks goaltender Blackwood and their defenseman Cody Ceci, and eventually leads to a defensive zone breakdown that the Rangers are able to capitalize on to get the tying goal. And then suddenly, the Rangers really began to up the pace in this one. They took full control of this game. The momentum was on their side, and they then piled on goal after goal after goal. One of them would get called off for the goaltender interference, but it was enough for the Rangers to have a 3-1 lead going into the third period. And the first few minutes of that third period was still Rangers control, though they wouldn't manage to add another goal to that one. However, eventually the Rangers would step back a little bit, the pressure would come off, and the Sharks would fill in that gap and start to get some chances themselves. Last year, it felt as though outside of maybe a couple of comebacks, like against the Islanders and the Red Wings, frequently when the Sharks would fall behind 2, 3, 4 goals, they'd pretty much just throw in the towel. But this year, that has rarely been the case, and this game was no exception to that. So even though they're behind 2 goals, they've just spent the last 20 minutes on their heels, not really managing to compete, they still believe they have the chance to tie this one up, and they came rather close. They had some good chances, and eventually it is Fabian Zetterlund on the power play plus with the goaltender pulled who brings this to within 1 with about 30 seconds to go. Unfortunately, a comedy of errors on the ensuing face-off right after would really prevent the Sharks from getting a great chance on net in those last 30 seconds, and so indeed they would still end up the losers here. But I would say they shouldn't be too disappointed with how this game played out. Of course, the players aren't going to be happy with the fact that they lose this one, but for instance, from Mike Greer's perspective up in the press box, he would likely be somewhat satisfied with how this game went down. Moving on to the players to talk about, we have the Sharks top line of Macklin Celebrini, Tyler Toffoli, and Barclay Goodrow. I talked about how at the end of that Philadelphia Flyers game, it seemed as though Warsofsky was angling towards having Goodrow on the top line for this next game, and unfortunately I was correct with that guess. That is indeed where he finds himself, and to the dismay of many Sharks fans, including myself, perhaps every single Sharks fan, honestly. And it is a decision that really doesn't make much sense. Prior to that game-tying goal against the Philadelphia Flyers, he had gone the previous 15 games without so much as even a single point scored, which is already not good for a third liner, and it is genuinely awful for a first liner, and yet that's where he currently finds himself. So he's kind of fallen upwards, akin to like a Nick Bonino was something that we saw him do multiple times when the Sharks had a really bad roster a few years ago. But this year, things have improved. You would think that that's not going to be the case, and yet here we are, Barclay Goodrow top liner. However, with that being said, while I was fully ready to come into this one and rip this decision to shreds, it should be noted that Goodrow actually wasn't that bad. Don't get me wrong, I'm not happy about him being on the first line. I don't think this is a long-term solution. In fact, I would be quite happy if the Sharks would immediately have him not on the first line for the very next game on Saturday. But by some minor miracle, perhaps going up against his former team where he had a bit of a falling out with in the offseason because they put him on waivers to avoid his no trade clause, perhaps because of that factor, he actually shows up and plays a decent enough game, at least by his own standards. If he was actually a slightly more offensively skilled player, he probably could have had a goal or two here tonight. He had a great chance early on. He had a short-handed breakaway early in the third period, and then a great chance set up by Macklin Celebrini in the last few minutes of the third period as well. So there were some chances for Barclay Goodrow to actually get on the board here tonight, and I will actually go so far as to say that Goodrow wasn't even the worst player on this top line here tonight, because the title there likely has to go to Tyler Toffoli, who has honestly been the most frustrating player on the San Jose Sharks this season. That's not to say he's been the worst. There have been many worse players. You only have to take a look at the Sharks' defense to find like half of them there. But Toffoli is someone who came in with some relatively high expectations. It was expected that he'd be able to be a not necessarily driving force, but a very important piece of this team. And I feel as though he has somewhat fallen short of that. Sure, on paper, statistically, he's been all right. 11 points in 18 games. That puts him on pace for about 50 points for a full season, which is around what you were probably hoping for him to be able to put up. But it is the way he is actually getting these points. The fact that you can go through a full 60-minute game and say, I didn't really notice Toffoli, but then you look at the score sheet and he's picked up like an assist there. I don't really see that as that much of a positive. I wasn't expecting the flashiness of a Granlund or the flashiness of a Celebrini, but I was still expecting him to, on every given night, at least be a top 5 forward for the San Jose Sharks, and it feels as though we have rarely managed to hit that mark this season. It feels as though outside of a few games, more often than not, he's like average, and a lot of the times, including here tonight, he is a decent bit below average as well. There were multiple turnovers here that his defensive game, while not awful, is not particularly good at all. It feels as though, even though he has constantly found himself on the Sharks top line throughout this entire season thus far, there have been multiple occasions where he could have been lowered, although we have seen his ice time suffer at times. In fact, tonight, he only ends up with about 15 minutes of ice time, which is relatively low by his standards, so maybe Warsofsky felt the exact same way that I'm feeling. It's just, I feel as though we're not really getting enough from Tyler Toffoli throughout much of this season thus far, and you're hoping that that is something that can turn around with the amount of opportunities he has been given. When it comes to the final player on this line, we do have Macklin Celebrini, who had an incredibly up and down game, I would say. I thought he started this game off rather well. When the Sharks were playing pretty good in the first period, Celebrini was a part of that. Not so much from an offensive perspective, where outside of a couple of okay looks, there wasn't a ton doing, but I really liked his defensive effort through the first 25 or so minutes of this game. He had some good sticks in shooting lanes. He was making some smart reads. He's actually able to, even as an 18-year-old, use his body well to protect the puck and get these strong clears out of the zone as well. But then once the Rangers kind of raised the stakes there in the latter parts of the second period, we definitely saw Celebrini struggle a considerable amount. It was not a very good 15-minute or so window for himself at the end of the second and at the beginning of the third period. That giveaway in the first few minutes of the third on that weak pass to the defense is something that you really don't expect Celebrini to be making at this point. However, what I will say about this player is his response to having these bad shifts is so incredibly impressive. You can tell just how competitive of an individual he is. Sure, every single player in the NHL is a very competitive player, but it feels as though Celebrini is at an entirely different level in that particular area, because his response to having a few bad shifts is to go out there and immediately put up a few good shifts. Some players might just throw in the towel. They'll say, oh, you know what, I'm not having a very good night, and then they'll get benched, or they'll have a few off shifts, and then they'll just kind of go away quietly. Celebrini is very far from that type of player. So even though his latter parts of the second, the early parts of the third were not good, we even saw him actually get demoted for a couple of shifts on the third line, he responds very, very well. He gets a few great shifts at the end of the third, and so all in all, I can't be even that disappointed with how Celebrini played here tonight. When it comes to the Sharks' second line, we of course have the Lund line. I mean, they're really only the second line on paper. You could probably consider them the top line, especially after their great performance in the previous game against the Philadelphia Flyers. But as we know, the New York Rangers are a very good team. It's not going to be easy to come out with dominant shift after dominant shift, and the Lund line did struggle at times here tonight. However, when the Sharks would get their good offensive zone time, more often than not, it did feel as though it was these three players involved. It is still remaining the line that has the absolute most amount of chemistry here on the San Jose Sharks. They had a great shift to start this game. Their first shift of the game was really, really impressive. They had a few really good ones as well in the third period, so I can't be too disappointed with that. When it comes to Fabian Zetterlund, I thought he continued to be putting up these solid performances. What I've really liked about Zetterlund on this Lund line is that he very much understands his role and what he needs to be doing when playing with these two players. One of the major issues with Fabian Zetterlund in the early parts of the season, when he was on like with Will Smith, or he was on with Danil Gushchin or Alex Wennberg or these types of guys, is that he felt as though he was maybe trying to do a little bit too much, which then led to him really not doing all that much of anything. But he knows what Eklund is doing, he knows what Granlund is doing, and so he understands what he needs to be doing. And I've really liked that over these last few games. When it comes to Eklund, he continues to show some pretty solid improvement. I can't necessarily say improvement, because even though Warsofsky wasn't happy with his game a couple of games ago, I didn't necessarily agree with that. I feel as Eklund, outside of those first few games of the year where he was kind of ramping up, he's been more often than not pretty good for the San Jose Sharks. Here tonight, definitely no different. I thought he set up some decent chances. He's still doing his classic good work below the goal line, and so it was a solid game for him. It should be noted, of course, when I say solid performances, this is kind of relative to the rest of the San Jose Sharks. If you take a look at that 20 minutes of play where the Rangers were completely dominant, nobody really looked all that great there. So you could theoretically come in and say, well, all of these players were terrible. But, I think that is taking it a little bit too far. So if you kind of not necessarily exclude that terrible portion of play for the San Jose Sharks, but maybe don't give it as much emphasis, that's really where I am when it comes to evaluating these players currently for this game. And when it comes to the final player on this line, the final Lund, Mikael Granlund, I actually liked a lot of these very small but very sneaky good plays that he made in this one. His ability to protect the puck along the boards, he's taking hits. The Rangers were relatively physical, at least in the latter half of this game, and yet he's managing to take these hits, still make these plays. Very, very impressive, and definitely something to learn from for a couple of the other Sharks young centers that they have in Celebrini and Will Smith. When it comes to the third line, speaking of Will Smith, I actually thought this was a really impressive start to this game. This first period may have been Will Smith's best of the entire season, definitely up there in like a top 3 or top 5 period for him this season. It felt as though most of the shifts that he was on the ice, he was at least making something happen. It did fall off, of course, in the second, and he was very much victimized on some of those really impressive Rangers shifts where he was just unable to keep up from a defensive standpoint with what the Rangers were doing offensively. But then we saw in the third period, when the Sharks began to bring it back, Will Smith was definitely a big part of that, and it was very nice to see him on, at least in some cases, in the 6-on-5 situation. He played a decent enough role there. He got that shot towards the net that ends up eventually leading to the Fabian Zetterlund goal. I won't really give him a ton of credit for it, but he was involved at least in some way, and so I thought this was definitely one of Will Smith's better games. And one thing that should be noted is that we did see a few shifts near the end with Will Smith and Macklin Celebrini on a line 5-on-5 together. Whether this means something moving forward, I'm not entirely sure, because we saw them also have a pretty bad defensive zone shift for themselves when those two were together, and that is maybe going to give Ryan Warsofsky some nightmares and prevent him from trying to really pull the trigger in that area. But when they were on and when they were in the offensive zone, there was potentially some good chemistry there, and so it would be a very interesting experiment, especially going up against a weaker team here for this next game, the Pittsburgh Penguins, if the Sharks wanted to head in that direction. When it comes to the two other players on this line, the other winger here, Ty Dellandrea, I wasn't really impressed with. Dellandrea bumped down from the first line to the third line, likely where he belongs, but he didn't really get much done here. And then when it comes to Alex Wennberg, it's Alex Wennberg. yeah, that's pretty much it. I thought he had some okay plays. He was doing some decent things with Will Smith early on in this game, as I mentioned. Wasn't really able to finish on a lot of them, so there was that slight disappointment there, but he was an okay player enough for the Sharks as per usual. And then when it comes to the Sharks' fourth line, so we saw Giovanni Smith step out, Grundstrom stepped back in. He is with Sturm and Cunnin, and it was really a night and day performance for them. They were so bad when it was Giovanni Smith in place of Grundstrom in that game against the Philadelphia Flyers, and they were quite good here tonight. Probably the most consistent line for the San Jose Sharks. They obviously didn't have the high highs of the Lund line or the Celebrini line, but when they were on the ice, the Rangers rarely managed to get much generated offensively, and they, while not getting tons of great chances for themselves, were usually playing in the offensive zone. They were on the ice when Liljegren scored. Not exactly a super impressive stat because, of course, Liljegren goals was entirely luck-based with the deflections that it actually took towards the net, but still, they did get the plus for it, and so you can't be all that disappointed. I actually was rather impressed with Carl Grundstrom in particular on this fourth line. I thought he had a really nice game stepping back into it. When it comes to the Sharks defensively, we again have the absence of Jake Wallman. His injury has ended up being more severe than was originally anticipated, clearly, considering he has missed these last few games due to health reasons. When it comes to the defense, compared to how this game has gone, it's a bit difficult to evaluate because, as I mentioned, there was that 25-minute period in which the Rangers just completely controlled the game, and so every single defenseman for the San Jose Sharks were making multiple mistakes. There was no real exception to that. Liljegren, Ceci, Thrun, Thompson, Ruda, Ferraro, all of them had major issues during that time. However, some were a lot better when the Sharks actually looked quite solid. So I'll start off with that top pairing of Thrun and Ceci that I thought looked quite good through a decent chunk of this game. Thrun did have the blown coverage on the first Rangers goal. He probably should have been more aware of where Mika Zibanejad was on this one to be able to tie up his stick, and that's really what starts the momentum shift for the New York Rangers. But I won't put a ton of blame on Henry Thrun for that because I thought otherwise he actually played a rather solid game. He continues to be so much better when played in a role where he's actually given significant ice time. I don't know if that's like some sort of correlation there, because when he's been playing on this third pairing through much of this season, he's been kind of give and take, not so great, but over these last 3 games when playing on this top pairing and getting big minutes and 20 plus minutes a night, he's been very, very effective for the San Jose Sharks, which has been quite nice to see. Cody Ceci, another player who, like I said, struggled at times in this game when the Rangers were really pushing. He had that miscommunication with Blackwood that eventually led to that Zibanejad goal, but more often than not, I thought Ceci was all right. When it comes to the second pairing, we do have Liljegren with Mario Ferraro again. Liljegren was quite good against the New Jersey Devils, then was really bad against the Philadelphia Flyers. I do think he actually managed to rebound here tonight. He scores his first goal for the San Jose Sharks, which was nice to see, even if it wasn't necessarily well done by him fully. And defensively, I think he definitely cleaned things up. There weren't these weak passes out of the zone to absolutely nobody. He played with a lot more purpose here tonight, and so I appreciated his performance. He was definitely one of the Sharks' better defenders. When it comes to Mario Ferraro, it was, as per usual, quite the opposite. He was not one of the Sharks' better defenders. He was running around in the defensive zone as he normally does. There weren't the egregious giveaways like there usually are, which I guess is somewhat of an improvement, but still hemmed into his own zone a lot, not really being a big portion of these breakouts like a Timothy Liljegren would be, not exactly doing a ton of time, because there was at times where he and Liljegren were actually separated, and we saw him with shifts with like Ceci, we saw him get a shift with Jan Ruda as well. In those times, it was really exposed just how still not good of a puck mover that Mario Ferraro actually is, and so this was definitely not a good game, which I guess is kind of to be expected with him throughout this entire season. When it comes to the Sharks' third pairing, we have Ruda and Thompson. Thompson, as a defenseman, probably struggled the most out of all of them when the Rangers were actually bringing that speed. Thompson seemed to really, really struggle in that particular area. We saw him kind of step up in a really weird spot on the Rangers' third goal that would actually manage to go in, overloading onto Artemi Panarin, which ended up leaving Trocheck completely available. Maybe he thought Tyler Toffoli was going to step in to handle that, but probably something that Thompson should have hung back a little bit more. But when the Sharks were actually playing decently well, I thought Thompson was managing to follow suit in that. He still provides at least a decent offensive element, though it wasn't fully on display here tonight. So I can't say I'm too disappointed with how Thompson played, but it certainly wasn't a great game. And then when it comes to Jan Rutta, there were issues for Rutta. He fell over like 3 times in this game, simply unopposed, like not even tripped. He just kind of fell down, which is a good indication of how Jan Rutta has been playing for much of this season. Just unforced errors from him for sure. Not necessarily as bad as like a Mario Ferraro, I guess, through this game, but still not a lot of positives there. And then when it comes to the goaltender for the San Jose Sharks, Mackenzie Blackwood, hard to put really too much blame on him. He had very little chance on the Zibanejad goal. He had very little chance on the Trocheck goal. Perhaps that other one, maybe, but probably not still. And he made a lot of pretty good saves in that first period. He had some great saves in the early parts of the third period as well. And so honestly, I give a lot of credit to Mackenzie Blackwood. It was a great game from him. It's just unfortunate that the Sharks couldn't really handle what the Rangers were bringing through a decent chunk of this game. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Saturday, where they will conclude this road trip against the Pittsburgh Penguins. It's kind of a back and forth here thus far in this road trip. Go against a good Devils team, not so good Flyers team, good Rangers team, not so good Penguins team. Sharks will be facing off against Erik Karlsson once again here. The Sharks have kind of flipped that trade on its head. They look like a pretty big winner from that trade, not only with that first round pick, but also how well Granlund has been and how poorly the Penguins have been with Erik Karlsson. And so we shall see if they can finish the road trip off on a high note. Class dismissed.